Okay, so I am here with Dr. Ollie Johansson and Mr. Paul Doyon. Mr. Paul Doyon is a CEO and founder of Electromagnetic Safe Planet. He's been working with them for approximately 12 years, helping those suffering from electromagnetic radiation sickness, and is helping to raise awareness about the negative health effects of the increasing amounts of electromagnetic fields in our environments. And Dr. Johansson is an retired associate professor from the Karolinska Institute and in the Department of Neuroscience, and has background in neuroscience and has co-authored over 140 papers. And we are very grateful to have him here today at 9CI. How about a little bit about yourselves, gentlemen?
Should I start then?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. Actually, it's more than 800 papers if we should be picky.
Oh, wow.
So I have been around for quite some time. And in Sweden, it all started at the end of the 1970s, where people in Norway and in the United States started to complain about skin irritation, skin rashes, pricking pain, and similar cutaneous sensations when they started to use the newly introduced personal computers with big cathode ray computer screens. And soon it started to spread. The first persons here in Sweden came around in the beginning of the 1980s. And from the very, very start, it was obvious that something was going on with their immune system. And you had these reactions all the way out into the cutaneous layers like the epidermis and the dermis. And I happened to listen actually to a radio program one evening. And you see, I never listened to radio. And someone had left the radio on in the laboratory at the Karolinska Institute, where I was working as a neuroscientist. And I listened suddenly to a program, and I couldn't help continue listening because there was a woman, Kajsa Wedin is her name, from the trade unions here in Sweden. And she talked about these kind of people with skin irritations in such a way, so I thought, wow, it sounds like a classical radiation damage, like from radioactivity or from X-ray or from ultraviolet light / sunlight. So I thought, it doesn't sound very peculiar. You put people in front of a very strong radiation source and they start to react as if they would have been in front of uranium, plutonium, radium. So I contacted her and said that, hey, we could perhaps help you. And we had a meeting in the early 1980s, and together with a physicist from Chalmers Technical University in Göteborg on the west coast of Sweden. And we all met at the Karolinska Institute. And to make a very long story short, that's the reason why you actually talk to and interview me right now, because that became the main interest since then. So I've been around for more than 40 years. And before you press record, we talked a little bit about that things are still very active and ongoing, and they are, I would say that nearly every day I get a new publication of some sort, and people are much more concerned. Nowadays, when I travel around, right now we have the coronavirus, of course, but I still travel around in Sweden, but also when I go abroad and I meet people, depending on where I go, people are very well educated, like in Italy, for instance. They are very little educated, like in the United States, or they are somewhere in between, like in Sweden. And I see as one of my goals is to put seeds into people's mind. And what I generally would do is if I, for instance, travel a commuter train or a bus or underground, I would lean in forward, and no one knows who I am. I'm not famous in any way, so I would lean forward and just ask people with a cell phone. I would ask them, do you know that the World Health Organization in Geneva in Switzerland has actually cancer classified the various types of electromagnetic fields and radiation from this gadget you're holding in your hand? And people would then answer sometimes, yes, I do know, or some would say, no, I don't. And most people actually don't know. And they look very surprised. And just recently I had a very posh lady in one of the commuter trains in Stockholm, and she actually got very angry with me and started to yell at me that I should mind my own business and so on. But I said, well, stop. I said, you have a smartphone in your hand. You can Google the keywords like the WHO, radio frequency, and brain tumors. And actually she did. And she was silent for like 3, 4, 5 minutes. And then she slowly looked up and looked at me and said, wow, you were actually right. I'm sorry that I yelled at you. You were completely right. And this is very common, and people get, as in her case, angry, not with me, but sequentially with the government, the parliament, the health authorities, radiation protection authorities, who hasn't informed them. And as she said, I am both a mother and a grandmother. And what you tell me now, I don't want this to happen to my children or grandchildren. No way. And I'm going to write a letter to the Swedish Parliament and government, and I hope she did, because she wanted to alert them as good as possible. And then, of course, finally, in Sweden, we addressed, before you press the record button, the question about electrohypersensitivity. And in Sweden, it's recognized as a functional impairment or disability, meaning it's not looked upon as a disease. There is no diagnosis. There is no treatment apart from symptom treatment. If you have, for instance, a headache, you can, of course, get aspirins on a prescription. But the treatment is to treat the environment. And the way to do it is through accessibility measures, such as shielding and or distance to the source that irritates your bodily systems. And that also means that the persons here in Sweden with electrohypersensitivity, they have their own handicap organization. They get governmental subsidy, quite a lot of money actually each year, and they are completely recognized, and they could go to the civil servants we have at the municipality level called Funktionshindersombudsman, which is the person that would help you if you have any form of disability or functional impairment. So the situation here is quite different compared to other countries. Yeah. So that's a short introduction,
Yeah. Apparently, Sweden and most of the European nations are actually quite a bit ahead of us in North America for that, in that regard. It's quite difficult to get treatment here, I believe, or specialist treatment. Paul?
Well, I got into this in 2005 because, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I was recently, well, at the time I had just been hired at Kyushu University as an associate professor, and I've been an English teacher for now 30 years. At that time, it was 15 years. And I started to get sick, and I didn't know what was going on. I started to wake up earlier and earlier. And I got to the point where I couldn't sleep. I had extreme thirst. I just had all these bizarre symptoms, and progressively was getting worse and worse, and started having anxiety attacks and skin rashes and red, dried out, irritated eyes. And I was Googling my symptoms, and what came up was chronic fatigue syndrome, or chronic fatigue immune dysfunction syndrome. And I started researching this and trying to find out, what was causing this problem. And at 6 months down the line, I was, I had seen doctors, and I went to see the chronic fatigue immune dysfunction syndrome doctor at Kyushu University Hospital. I was working at Kyushu University, and he basically told me that there was nothing he could do for me, and that I would just get sicker and sicker until I was bedridden. And so I eventually found this doctor in Saga Prefecture, which is right next to Fukuoka, where I was living. And he was, quite a eccentric, maybe, doctor. He had started out as a surgeon, and he was the head of the, of a hospital. I think the surgeon. But then he eventually, started his own practice and got into alternative medicine, and he invented this machine that was called the Zero Search machine, and it checked frequencies. So when I went to see him, I was looking at his pamphlet, and his name is Dr. Yayama. And on his pamphlet, he says, okay, these are the 4 or 5 major causes of modern day diseases. Okay, one is chemical toxicity. The other one is heavy metal toxicity. And then and then he had electromagnetic fields, and that was part of his diagram. And then I think, kind of like psychological stress and these kinds of things. And when he used his machine on me, he was able to say, okay, you have systemic candida, you have Epstein-Barr virus, you have cytomegalovirus, you have mycoplasma infection, you have mercury toxicity, you have lead toxicity, and you have toxoplasmosis, right? So yeah, my immune system had completely broken down, and I had all these infections. And when I drove back to my home in Fukuoka that day, I just noticed all these cell phone towers, on the road that I had never noticed before. And I was living within 200 meters of probably about 2 major cell phone towers, and then there were a few more, within 500 meters of my apartment. So I started to suspect that it was the cell phone radiation that was causing my problems. And I had gotten a cell phone at the time. I didn't have one. And the only reason I got one was because my son has these anaphylactic shock type allergies, and we were worried that maybe if something happened at the kindergarten, they needed to call us. So, but I didn't like this thing, and I didn't like to use it. And if someone called me, I just didn't want to talk. I wanted to hang up right away. I didn't trust them. But then, we decided to look for a place that wasn't near these cell phone towers, and we found a log house, and there were no bars on our cell phones, and we rented it for like 3 days originally, and within 24 hours I could feel 50% of these bizarre symptoms that I was having disappeared. So I ended up living there for 3 months, and I was seeing this doctor that was, at that point he was like 25, 30 minutes away, so I could go see him. And it was all paid for with, the Japanese medical health insurance. So not like in America where they just milk you. You go see a doctor and it costs you $1,000 just for an appointment. But yeah, so I was seeing this doctor, and I eventually, he had me on Chinese herbs, and I eventually did chelation therapy to get the heavy metals out, and that helped a lot. But I started researching EMFs and the effects, and also the correlation between chronic fatigue syndrome and microwave sickness, basically. And I found all these correlations, and I published a paper which got a lot of fanfare. And it's like people got sick in 1984. This is when chronic fatigue syndrome first appeared in the United States, 1984. Well, this was also the year the first generation of cell phone networks that were set up in the United States, 1984. And they didn't even have a name for it in 1984. The media called it yuppie flu. Well, who were the first people in 1984 to have cell phones and to be using computers? They were the yuppies. So, I mean, this all fits. So these are all pieces of the puzzle. And, you know, I found like 30 correlations, you know, between, you know, chronic fatigue syndrome and what they call microwave sickness, or, you know, I looked at all the research on these effects that you were seeing with people in chronic fatigue syndrome. And there was all this research, you know, showing that the EMFs would produce these effects or these symptoms. And, you know, when, you know, this paper basically, you know, is an experiential paper because, you know, I had all these infections, you know, and then I was reading about calcineurin inhibitors, and I was like, wow, this creates all the infections that I had. So maybe there's some connection between the inhibition of calcineurin and, you know, EMFs. So that's how it all started. Yeah.
Could I just add a few points there? It's extremely interesting to listen to Paul. And here in Sweden, and my experience in other countries too, if we go back to the early 1980s and still the same today, you know, people would, for instance, at the workplace, notice that something was wrong. They loved their work. They loved their new computer. It was great fun, you know, but something was wrong in the environment. And the way they noticed it was because when they got back in the evening to their home, the skin symptoms, for instance, or heart palpitations or breathing problems would go away and wouldn't start until the next day when they came back. But they didn't associate it at all with the computers or the electromagnetic fields or anything like this. And then when they became worse, they would need like the weekend to cure themselves. And then finally, not even a 5-week holiday would be enough. And they would have reached the level of having a severe electrohypersensitivity, but still not understanding or connecting the dots, you know, and it would take quite some time before their attention would be drawn to like a computer screen, and they started to ask questions. And even today, you know, I could have people calling me on their cell phone complaining about classical electrohypersensitivity issues. And I say to them that, well, maybe it could be your cell phone you're using right now. And they would go, no, why should it? They don't connect it at all, you know. And, you know, very often people would change everything they were wearing, the washing powder, the detergents they used, the soap and anything. They would look through what they had for dinner and lunch and breakfast, and they would get rid of their dog and cat and so on, so on, so on. But they didn't become any better at all. And then if we move forward into the mid 2000s, I was then connected to a group, and we started to write chapters, which later on became the Bioinitiative report. And my chapter became electrohypersensitivity, which was natural in a way, but they also said, well, we don't have anyone for the immune system reaction. Couldn't you cover that as well? And I said, okay, then I will. And to, again, make a long story short, the electrohypersensitivity part was kind of easy to write, but the immune system became a little bit harder because I was surprised about the number of papers already done dealing with various artificial electromagnetic fields used in homes, offices, playgrounds, and so on, and alterations of the immune system. And I sort of went half through it, but when the Bioinitiative report was launched, it was soon decided that a few of the chapters, including my own chapter, should be taken not taken out, but they should be copied and sent to a scientific peer-review-based journal in Finland called Pathophysiology. And then I was asked again to update the chapter, and I put down an enormous amount of work into it. And finally I felt, wow, now I have it all covered. But I felt very insecure, because what all the papers taken together would show me was that initially the immune system, as it always does, tries to fight it. It gets activated, but after some time it reaches the peak and then quickly deteriorates. And in layman terms, you can say the immune system starts to leak in a way that is dysfunctional. And so I went to one of the leading experts actually in the world who worked at the Karolinska Hospital just across the road, and asked her, please, could you read this manuscript? Because I must have misunderstood a lot of things, you know. It's kind of scary to read it, but please, could you? And she said yes, and it took a number of weeks before she came back. And she was very, how should I say, composed. And she said that, wow, it's a fantastic manuscript. There is nothing you need to change. And unfortunately, all your conclusions are 100% correct. And it was sent to the Pathophysiology, then it was published as a peer review based chapter in one of the issues, a special issue actually. So it's there really, and it's still, well, some people say it's kind of prophetic because it pointed forwards to what would come. As Paul said before, you know, at one point he realized that maybe it could be something in the environment, and particularly the electromagnetic fields. And then he became more and more and more interested. And when he contacted me and having this crazy idea about a mechanistic explanation for not only electrohypersensitivity, but maybe other effects such as brain tumor developments and so on, I said, okay. But being, well, Swedish to begin with, you know, and trained at the Karolinska Institute and the Royal Institute of Technology, being an academic scholar really, and unfortunately maybe I'm very, very picky. I'm very accurate with everything. So I remember I told Paul that this is not going to be fun for you, I said to Paul, because I will pick on you all the time. But it turned out to be a tremendous friendship, and he allowed me to pick and have criticism and so on. And eventually we said, yeah, let's send it. And it was published, and it's one of the better papers in my very extensive publication list, and it still holds water to 100%, and it points to one possible mechanistic explanation. And I do hope that we will get more possibilities. And I'm retired, unfortunately, so it's very difficult now to get any money for research, but both Paul and I, we are trying our hardest.
Excellent. Yeah. So for anyone who hasn't read the paper is called Electromagnetic Fields May Act via Calcineurin Inhibition to Suppress Immunity, thereby increasing risk for opportunistic infection. It's a conceivable mechanism of action, which is what you've just summarized. And it was a very interesting paper. It was very well written. It actually was pretty, I would think, easy to understand if someone just wanted to read it. If they're not really big into reading journal articles, it was pretty easy to understand, I think, as a scale. Yeah, and that was incredibly interesting. So you are obviously retired, and Mr. Doyon, Paul, does not work in the research field, but you both do. Have you been up to date on doing anything recently in the past few years?
Well, I could start again, you know.
Yeah.
You know, I'm retired, but that doesn't mean anything. I work more than ever, and I'm engaged in a number of research projects. I've just finished a paper together with a Japanese collaborator, and it's not only finished, but we have got the referee remarks and we have answered them, so it's back at the editorial office, and hopefully it will be published soon. And 2 days ago, I had a commentary published here in Sweden, and I haven't had time yet to send it out. So Paul, for instance, haven't seen it yet, but I will start sending it out to everyone that is interested. And it's more about the political game around this, because one thing that was very strange for me was that early, like in the 1980s, as I said before, we started to publish findings, and they were just sort of very simple skin biopsies using different marker methodologies, revealing cell types, nerve fibers, molecules, etc. And it was just like looking on a map and pointing to that you saw different things that were dramatically changed. And one thing that was so obvious was that the cutaneous biopsies mimicked in an electrohypersensitive person exactly what you would see in a worker, for instance, exposed to very strong radioactivity, like at Fukushima in Japan or Chernobyl in in Ukraine. And so it was classical radiation damage. And we also saw that it was an activation of the immune system, as if they would have a strong flu, I would call it. We very often talked about in the 80s. It was like flu-type symptoms in the immune system. And the Swedish newspapers, which are, of course, on an international standard are very small, but in Sweden big, they had color photographs from the microscope on the front page of some of their newspaper issues. And of course, you were proud, you know, it's very uncommon to have scientific results being demonstrated in that way. But then something interesting happened, because then I saw that funding started to decrease, and more sort of key critical professors around me came to me and said basically that, no, you have to stop this, you know. And for me, being a scientist, I just couldn't understand what they were talking about. But later on, of course, digging journalists and reporters have revealed that there is many layers of political play under and economic play. And of course, I had started to open Pandora's box, and they said, no. And rather quickly, I would say, we ran out of funding. In the early 1990s, it was kind of it. And since then, we have tried our hardest year after year after year. And after retirement, I continue with people like Paul and others to try. But of course, it is difficult, and we're hoping that someone would more substantially support the research.
Yes, things get a little muddy as soon as money's involved, don't they?
Yeah, I know.
Right. I've noticed this a little bit. If the research has been out for 40 years, why do people not know about it?
But you know, one thing that is very positive right now, or should I say since the last 5 years, is that when I go to international meetings, because I'm very, very often invited, and that's very honorable for me, of course. Yes. And when I go there, the audience more and more ask for solutions, which is kind of a new idea for me. And you know, every coin has two sides, or even three sides. And one of the sides here definitely is the word solution. And commercial companies, I could just mention quickly a few, like in Poland, there is a company called Modita, and they have produced, and it's just now being launched on the market, a low radiation cell phone. Yes, quite a fantastic invention. And the telephone is called Modita Pure, and you can Google it and find it. And here in Sweden, we have a company called RPO Sweden, and RP stands for radiation protection. And what they do is they have cases like for Wi-Fi routers, for tablets, and for cell phones, which would reduce the exposure quite dramatically. For cell phones, the reduction is in the order of between 70 to 99%. And one very important comment here, they have not done these measurements themselves. They have been done 100% independently by a measurement expert company in Finland called Verkotan, and they came up with these results. And it's fantastic, I would say. And I recommend people to Google rpofsweden.com. I think it's the web link to them. And since we're talking about the case for maybe 40, 50 American dollars, it's just nothing really. And I am not saying that it will help for instance, protecting immune responses, but at least it will reduce the exposure quite dramatically. And there are a lot more like this, you know,
Do the phones still work, or is it meant to be like a case?
Oh, no. Yeah, it works perfectly well.
Oh.
Yes, it does. Yes, and also these cases, they have other good sides. For instance, the telephone becomes shock-proof. And, you know, particularly for parents bending over their kids, having the cell phone in a pocket, it slips out, falls into the floor, and they crack the front glass. They are extremely happy about this because you should really be unlucky to be able to crack it, you know. And that saves money for them, of course.
Exactly. And it's not exposing their children to...
Right. Yes.
Growing bodies.
Yeah, indeed.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And why is this not more readily available?
Yeah. So, and as I say, you can just buy it via internet, and they have for tablets, for Wi-Fi routers, for baby alarms that you put on your baby crib and so on.
Right. Yeah.
There's an enormous surge for these products. People are very concerned worldwide, and just a short story. And Paul, I know that you want to say something. I'm sorry that I keep on, but I was recently down in Italy and gave lectures, including in front of the Italian Parliament in Rome. But then I had also promised that I would, for like a week, travel around in Italy to meet people with electrohypersensitivity and their relatives, and also give sort of spontaneous lectures to them. And already when I started this trip, I went to Stazione Termini in Rome, and I felt I needed to have a cup of coffee before entering the train. And the waiter who came up, I don't know why, but I just said something about, you know, I'm starting this week-long journey, and I will talk about adverse health effects of electromagnetic fields from like cell phones and cell phone towers. And he just said, oh yeah, I know. What? You know? Oh yeah, I know a lot. Yeah. And every time I talked with someone, wherever it was, like a train conductor or people at the coffee shop somewhere or a restaurant or the landlord where I was sleeping and so on, everyone would go, oh yeah, yeah, I know. And they actually did know. They knew a lot. And that has to do with that in 2019, the Supreme Court ordered the Italian government that they had to inform the Italian population about the potential risks and dangers of these kind of electromagnetic fields. And so they did, beautifully, I must say. And as I said before, in Sweden, it would be like a mix between some knowing, some not. And I'm sorry to say, when I was in September in the United States, fantastic journey, visiting a number of different cities and meetings and conferences, hardly anyone knew anything.
Really? In Italy?
Yeah.
In the United States?
Yes.
That's amazing. So there are people out there that do know that this is a possible risk, but...
But it seems to be country by country. Like in Italy, it seemed to be everyone, maybe thanks to the information campaign from the Italian government. In Sweden, it's, as I say, kind of 50-50. But in United States, no one I talk to, apart from like professor colleagues, but I mean, the lay persons in the street, they will go, no, I've never heard about this, you know.
Huh.
In the United States, I think most people have been brainwashed by the media to believe that anyone that talks about this issue is a tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theorist Luddite, and they shut you down when you try to talk about it. And I learned very quickly to just, you know, not talk about it and keep my mouth shut when I was in the United States or talking to Americans. You know, when I was in Sweden recently, and I visited Ali, and we had lunch together. But you know, just talking about the 5G and the coronavirus, you know, most people I talked to seem to think there was a connection, but in the United States, you know, they completely cannot see that possibility. And I think it's just people have been programmed by the media, you know, to regurgitate things. You know, it's on the TV. You know, I pretty much stopped watching TV in the 1970s. So, you know, I turn on the TV and turn it off in about 5 minutes because it's just complete nonsense, you know. Yeah.
Could I say,
programming.
Yeah, but I agree to 100%. And it's very much the same in Sweden and elsewhere. But there are exceptions. And I want to bow to the floor to the people behind HBO in United States. The series and the programs they produce, they are top notch. They are even better than like BBC and the Swedish public TV, which is tremendously good. But HBO, wow. But that's a very, very small, and I think it's like a cable channel or something.
It's a cable channel, yes.
Yeah, they exported to Sweden. So right now we have one of their series going in Swedish public TV. And I promise you, people are glued to the television, you know.
Okay.
I mean, who isn't glued to technology these days?
I lived in California in the 1980s, and I just didn't have time to watch TV. I was too busy doing things.
Yeah.
And then, you know, I left the United States in 1988 to go teach English in Japan. And, you know, I lived abroad for 25 years before I went back, and I was back in the United States for 5 years, and decided to leave about a year and a half ago to go to China. And I got kind of tired of all this EMF stuff. I kind of wanted to forget about it. And I just got too busy, you know, working in China. My jobs were very busy. But then when the coronavirus COVID-19 hit, you know, I started to look into it. I had heard that Wuhan had 10,000 5G antennas, and I started to look into that. So that's what I've been working on most recently. And if we talk about it, maybe your video on YouTube might get shut down. So
hopefully not.
They are shutting down conversations about this.
Yeah, Kyla, could I ask you, because if I understand correctly, you work at the company that produces some form of meters?
Yes, we develop RF meters.
Yeah, and that's extremely important, I must say. But at the same time, you know, from a scientific point of view, and I will make a gross comparison. Just imagine that you have in your hand right now a pistol, a revolver. And you can weigh it, and you can say that it weighs this and that. You can measure the length, the width. You can look at the color, the metal composition, but you don't know anything because you are from outer space. This is the first time you see such a weapon, and you are examining it, you know, and you don't understand that actually there is a cardboard box in one of the drawers in your desk, and it contains bullets, and the bullet, the velocity when it enters biological matter, that's what's actually harming and killing something or someone. If you don't know this, of course you can sort of hammer someone to death, maybe with a Probably. But otherwise, you would sit there, and feeling, wow, I have done everything I can. And that's really what we're talking about, because in biophysics, we have a number of, and you are really an expert, of course, of that, ways to measure electromagnetic fields, or electric and magnetic fields separately, and radiation. And we can talk about like specific absorption rate, power density, and so on. But we don't know which one of these that actually blends together with the questions about biological and medical impacts. Maybe we should measure something completely different, and we still don't know. So therefore, I hope that you and your colleagues will continue to develop the whole idea around how should one measure these fields, and in such a way so it makes sense for me being in the medical and biological field.
Yes. Yeah, we are trying to work towards finding out what we're supposed to be measuring. But for now, we're just trying to develop something that measures accurately, because RF is such a complex transmission system that it is actually very difficult to measure. So at least if we can be accurate. Yeah, exactly. Like all of the, just a big soup of information. So do we measure one specific frequency? Do we measure everything? Like obviously our bodies are absorbing everything, but for measurement's sake, being able to pinpoint what we need to know and what the dosages are for certain frequencies, or overall like pulse versus continuous, all of that, which one is the most harmful. And then we can at least start cutting stuff out, because it seems like if we're going to make a difference, we need to do it systematically and slowly, because I don't think that people would be very happy if we suddenly came out and said, no more cell phones, period.
Well, you know,
Yeah,
I mean, I agree to 100% with what you say, you know, and but at the same time, again, coming back to new thinking and alternatives, I see for our results when we publish different papers, there are certain countries, I would call it, that are much more interested in what we do than others. One country that is not interested in what we're doing is actually my own, Sweden. But I don't need to go further than to Norway, the neighboring country. They are extremely interested, and I would not say that that's probably the most sort of common invitation, is to go to a rather secluded meeting somewhere in Norway to talk with people from their industry and finance sector, because they are very interested in inventing tomorrow's green, human, and environmental friendly technology. And of course, if they would, then Norway would be even richer. They're already very rich, but even richer. And maybe tomorrow all cell phones will be labeled Norwegian rather than Motorola or Ericsson or Nokia or Huawei. And some other countries like that. Actually, United States, there are a few sort of projects that is emanating from there. And Malaysia is another country, England a little bit. So, but most countries, they don't give a toss about this, I would say. They continue using the kind of gadgets they either buy from other countries or they produce themselves. But I'm sure around the corner, maybe while we speak, there are young women and men in a garage in California inventing this new technology right now. And what it will be, we have no idea.
Exactly.
Maybe completely different, you know.
We need to change either way, but what the change will be, who can say? So what advice do you have for people just coming into this field? If you maybe didn't know that it was dangerous and all of a sudden you're like, yes, this could be something. What would you say?
Well, that's a very good question, you know, and it's always difficult to answer such a question. When I give lectures and people ask me the same, I start to say that don't blindly trust me. Make up your own mind. Go to the different sources, but be careful so you don't mix various whatever we should call them, fake news or whatever, with scientific facts with high credentials. Try to really ask yourself, why is it published in this format and by whom and who has sponsored it economically from the beginning and so on? Because as you know, there is a dramatic difference between industry-sponsored research and independent research. But to start and to listen to people like yourself, Kyla, and to Paul, and maybe to myself, and roam around a little bit and compare what they find and start thinking, because this is not rocket science. You know, rocket science you use to build a rocket, actually. This is actually pretty easy. It's simple, and it's just about the question, do we have through evolution an automatic shield to exposures invented the last century? And of course, the answer is obvious. No, we don't. And also the exposures we are talking about from safe, in quotation marks, cell phones are, compared to natural background, more than colossal, more than astronomical, more than biblically higher than the natural background. It's just enormous exposures, but they're invisible. So people don't see them and they don't think about it. But trust me, I mean, they're just fantastic exposures. And somewhere, you know, there will be a bill to pay. And that also answers another question about the big players in our society. Are they on board on the boat? No, they are not. They left the ship more than 20 years ago. And among them, you would find all insurance and reinsurance companies in the world. You would find, of course, the manufacturers leaving the ship, the operators still saying everything is 100% safe, but we cannot stay on the ship. Also, the World Health Organization has actually bailed out, and the world's radiation protection authorities. And United States, you have a fantastic saying, which I like very much: when in doubt, always follow the money. And the money has left the ship. And the only that are left are governments and parliaments and health authorities. And what I also see around the world, including American lawyers, is that they have now shifted their interest from the telecom industry to the governments and parliaments and so on. And the taxpayers being hit by future, for instance, brain tumors or immune system reactions or whatnot, they will actually ask for compensation from themselves, because in Sweden, at least, the government and parliament is to 100% based on taxpayers' money, on consumers' money. So it will be a very odd situation in the future when all these legal questions will come up on the table. And actually, they already are. There are a number of papers, including papers from myself, dealing with these questions within future courts of law. So it is, I would say, a surprising mess. And as I said before, that when I meet people and talk about that, sometimes people would go, no, that couldn't be like that. You know, we live in Sweden, it's a democracy and so on. But then when they start, and I tell me, why don't you call if Skandia, which is a small Swedish insurance company, and ask them? And when they do, they come back and say, hey, you were right, Ole Johansson. They do not take any form of responsibility for this. And neither does Swiss Re, Lloyd's UK, or any other insurance and reinsurance company.
That is disappointing to learn.
Well, but you know, these are private entities, and they decide for themselves what they're going to insure. So it's not the break of any law or anything like that, and they're completely open about it. I remember I was at a meeting in London, 2002. It's nearly 20 years ago, and for instance, Lloyd's UK were there, and a number of other insurance and reinsurance companies, and they all spoke out. It was a public meeting; anyone could come and listen, and they spoke out and said, for them, and this is 20 years ago, for them it was no question whether it was dangerous or not. They knew it was dangerous, no question about it. The only question was, they said, who is going to pay for it in the future? And we don't want to do that. And therefore, we have bailed out from any form of liability or responsibility.
It's always the money.
Yeah, yeah, of course. And I learned then, that insurance companies, they do have what they call and it's also public, a blacklist. It's very short. They would insure like Beyonce's legs, for instance, and gas-filled ships on the oceans and whatnot. But on this list, they have health effects of electromagnetic fields, all categories, all types, everything. No way. They have nanotechnology, which you find today in anything, in the air, soil, water, food, clothes, cosmetics, etc., etc., it's everywhere. No coverage. Gene-modified food. Yeah, exactly. Gene-modified food, corn, for instance, the same, no coverage. So a lot of things are sold to us, the consumers, in a format saying this is good for you, this is safe, no risk, but the insurance companies, the manufacturers, the operators, and so on, they don't believe in that. They know it's very dangerous.
Yeah.
And, for me, being a scientist, these facts we're talking about now, they are more telling than any mice or rat or test tube Paul and I could show you. They are completely translucent and tells you the actual truth. You
can look at the real world and just see what's going on. You don't need to have it on a cellular level exactly. to understand. Yeah, that's a very telling point. Paul, do you have anything you'd like to add for advice to the general public about?
Well, I think that people need to have an open mind about this, and realize that the media has, to a large degree, influenced your thinking about it. So there's what's called the doubting game and what's called the believing game. There's a guy named Elbow that wrote about this. He's a writing teacher, and there's another book called Doubt is Their Product. So the industry wants you to doubt that this is, when people say, well, this is harmful, they want you to doubt what they're saying and shut them down by calling them Luddites or conspiracy theorists or tinfoil hat wearing, crazy people. And that's what they want you to do. So people should not do that. They should be more open-minded. The people that are sensitive are the canaries in the coal mine. And we need to listen to the sensitive people. People were affected with 1G, and then more people were affected with 2G. And on up now with 5G, we're seeing more and more people that are being affected by this radiation because it's getting stronger and stronger. I have a colleague in China, and she, we're both working at the same school. I've actually haven't had a chance to go there because I finished my job at one school and I left and went for a vacation in Sweden, and then I wasn't able to go back to China. So I came to Thailand instead, where I've been kind of stuck for the last couple months. But my colleague, she was also hired at the school, and as soon as she got to the city, she started to feel sick. She couldn't breathe. She was having breathing problems, which is, one of the symptoms of the COVID, by the way.
Yeah.
And she started having anxiety attacks, and she never had these before in her life. And she started feeling depressed. And she went to the school doctor or the school nurse. They call them doctors in China, just to be polite, I guess. And who sent her to a psychologist or a psychiatrist who gave her, benzodiazepine, which is a very dangerous drug, without considering the facts. So I said, hey, let's look. Where do you live? Okay. When did they turn on the 5G? Yeah, exactly. She's living in a 5G hotspot. She moved into a 5G hotspot. The school is in a 5G hotspot. Oh. And she never realized this at all. And I had to point it out to her.
And there's children.
There's children, and you know, not everyone's affected, but more and more people are affected because it's the 5G. I mean, I talk to people every day, whereas, you know, 15 years ago, you know, you didn't meet that many people that were, you know, they were rare to find people that were so affected, but now you're seeing them right and left. You know, this guy staying at my hotel that I was staying at here in Thailand, you know, he's a medical doctor from Australia, and you know, he's like anti 5G. Says it's a 5G that's causing this, and I was like, yeah, I agree with you. You know, and he's also electrically sensitive, and you're seeing so many people. You know, this guy that I grew up with, we contacted each other on Facebook, and he said, yeah, my wife, you know, ever since they installed the smart meter, my wife started having these symptoms. What can we do about it, Paul? So, you know, with each generation, the number of people, the percentage of people being affected by this is increasing. And, you know, it's going to get to the point where you can't say, well, you know, it's not all in your mind anymore. You know, something's happening. And, you know, I'm just waiting for that to happen. You know, it's got to reach a breaking point. So I think people are starting to meet more and more people that are affected, and they're starting to take it seriously and not listen to, you know, what the media has programmed them into thinking about it. So yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Well, no, there are more than 2 cents. I would say there are $2,000. You know, that's very well said. It's brilliant, really. And you know, again, as I said before, you know that I have this kind of amateur idea that wherever I go, I would start a conversation with people just to put a seed into their brain. And one thing that is interesting to see, as you say, the media has really whitewashed the whole area. And when you tell them that the World Health Organization also has cancer classified, both power frequent magnetic fields, which is a long name for household electricity, as well as radio frequency fields, the latter in association with brain tumors, and the first in association with childhood leukemia. Nearly everyone goes, what? No one has told me this. I've just given my child a brand new smartphone, and no one has informed them about these questions and facts. And so I think one thing we all can do, and also all the people that will watch this, is to spread information. But avoid, of course, to spread any unfounded speculations, anything like that. Just to keep to the facts, because the facts, they are scarier than anything, I would say. The facts are very, very scary.
Well, I mean, you look at the facts. You know, with you know, Martin Paul had wrote a review paper on voltage-gated calcium channels. So, you know, EMFs open up the voltage-gated calcium channels, the calcium comes pouring into the cell, and this is part of our paper, you know, how it affects the immune system. But, you know, what's interesting, there's a paper that just came out by a number of Chinese researchers, Chen, and so on, and what they were, it's a review paper, and what they're showing is that viruses need calcium to proliferate. So here we have a mechanism of action. I'm not going to say what kind of mechanism, what it's related to, but okay, we have voltage-gated calcium channels opening up the voltage-gated calcium. You know, they're being opened by the EMFs. Calcium is pouring into the cell. Well, if we have a virus in the cell and viruses need calcium, that's a mechanism of action. And
you know, Paul, you know, we have like a double action here. You have the activation of the viruses concomitant with the reduction of the immune system capacity.
Exactly.
In both directions.
Right, right.
And already in 1996, I think it was, the Italian professor, I've forgotten his name right now, but there is a group in Italy, and they showed a similar activation of kind of common viruses that we have all around and in us all the time. And through, in that case, power frequent magnetic fields. It was Professor Grimaldi, Professor Grimaldi, and that was power frequent magnetic fields, 50 hertz, or in the United States, it would be 60 hertz. And it was kind of met like an interesting observation, because no one was thinking that there could be a massive problem many years down the line, which we have right now. And I'm not saying that this is the explanation for the COVID-19 and coronavirus outbreak, but it is fair to allow ourselves to discuss it, at least, you know.
Yeah, I think there's a number of factors which, you know, there's a multitude of factors. It's multifactorial.
Yeah.
But, you know, this is one factor, and it may be a very big factor. And, you know, they shouldn't shut down conversations, you know, if you're talking about the science and the possibilities. You know, it's not just wild speculation. We're looking at some science, and we're making a logical inference based on that science.
Mm-hmm. It's true. Yeah. Thank you. That was very informative. Thank you so very much for discussing and meeting with us. And I look forward to talking to you again, hopefully.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kyla.
Bye.